Thank you for joining us for artificial intelligence and legal ethics. We have presentations by a few people in our panel, and then we'll have a moderated discussion with them. Joining us are Professor Joy, Professor Tamanaha, Professor Kim. We'll be going through various elements of artificial intelligence and legal ethics, both at specifically legal level and then more at a societal level and things think about impact considerations of this layout. To start off, Professor Joy will begin. He's also going to present a report.
That's right. Hi, welcome everybody. Dean Lindquist is unable to be here, so she asked me to stand in for her to present the first Legal Tech Award, and it's being given to an alumnus of the law school, Todd Richheimer. Todd is the co-founder and CEO of a data-driven, justice-focused entity called Lofty that works on behalf of people who are injured. So with that, I'm going to make the formal presentation to Todd. So Todd, here it is. The Dean also. Also, the Dean first met Todd last year prior to the first legal tech work and was very interested in the work that he's been doing since graduating law school. Todd started off at a big law firm and realized that big law wasn't necessarily his future, and then co-founded Lofty and hasn't looked back. I'm going to kick this off with a focus on legal ethics, but as Ryan intimated, this is much broader than legal ethics, and both Brian Tamanaha and Pauline Kim will kind of fill in some of those other kinds of issues. But to sort of set the context for all of this, whoops, there we go. Artificial intelligence has come to the legal profession. Some of these slides will provide you with a little bit of context, as the first one shows. This is from 2024, 81% of all the people responding, ranging from in-house counsel, really large, Amjur 200 law firms to medium and smaller size law firms, believe that AI was compatible with legal work. I mean, the reality is it's probably 100%, though, as you see, some people just didn't know when they were responding. The market for generative artificial intelligence is projected to be growing by leaps and bounds, as the chart there indicates. In terms of the where the investment is going, you'll see law firms and general counsel across various areas are all budgeting for artificial intelligence. Last week, one of the persons who gave a keynote had on a slide a letter that the general counsel for Ford Motors sent to all the outside counsel that work for Ford, asking them to explain how they're going to be using artificial intelligence. So this is something that is on the minds of everybody in the legal profession. In terms of the top priorities for using generative AI, you'll see the first one is legal research. The reality is everybody's using artificial intelligence with legal research to some degree or another. There are some problems if one relies solely on what artificial intelligence is telling them, as we'll discuss here in a few minutes. ChatGPT has a special product, Law ChatGPT. Another one is, and there are probably at this point in time more than a dozen providers of artificial intelligence that are tailored to the legal profession. The first time that a lawyer was caught citing a fake or hallucinated citation was back in May of 2023. If you recall, ChatGPT came out in October of 2022, and that's at least the first reported case. One would think that after that got out in the news, that people would be a lot more careful about using ChatGPT for writing their briefs. But as of May of 2025, there were at least 120 court cases that identified lawyers using fake citations in their briefs. It hasn't stopped. And these next few slides are from last week. So October of 2025, we see again sanctions mounting for an attorney who ignored the fact that he was using fake citations. A tax court judge made a warning because they were seeing so many of them here not here, but in New York. A state court judge basically sanctioned an attorney for doubling down on AI. He had submitted something with fake citations. The other side pointed it out, and then his response brief had more fake citations in it. I know if someone had told me this before I read about it, I wouldn't have believed them, but it's true, it's there. So federal courts especially have been issuing standing orders, and this is just a slide from a collection of them, where they want various things. Now, some federal judges have actually had a standing order that said that lawyers practicing before that judge in that jurisdiction couldn't use artificial intelligence. That, I think, is unlikely to really be followed. I think what is more likely are the kinds of disclosures that some federal judges are asking, where if you have used artificial intelligence, you have to describe how you used it, and also you have to verify that you have checked every one of the citations. And the problem isn't just with fake citations. How many people have used the artificial intelligence companions for either LexisNexis, Westlaw, or Bloomberg? A show of hands. Okay. Well, if you've had the experience that I've had, it produces something that actually sounds pretty good, and it cites the cases that I go to take a look at to see, does the case really stand for what it says that it stands for? And more often than not, the cases do not stand for what they have said that they are supposed to stand for. So it's a problem that runs just, I would say much beyond just fake hallucinated citations. So there are a number of ethics rules, and I'm just going to sort of discuss a few of them. The very first one, which is also the very first ethics rule in the rules of professional conduct, is competence. And competence also includes, as a comment indicates, keeping abreast of changes in the law and its practice, including the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. That was added around the time that email became prevalent as a way of communicating, but it applies certainly to artificial intelligence. Another very important ethics rule is the rule of confidentiality. And client confidentiality extends to everything that a lawyer learns in the course of representing a client. But most particularly, one has to be careful about sharing client information. And as a comment points out, that the prohibition about sharing client information not only applies to directly, talking about a particular client's case, but disclosing any information that could lead someone to figure out who the client is. So if you put any client information into any of the open artificial intelligence systems like ChatGPT, that's being used by ChatGPT for continual training. And if you put in client information, opposing counsel or someone else might be able to discover something about your client based on the information you put in. That's why a lot of law firms that are now using artificial intelligence are getting proprietary systems, ones that are closed, where the information doesn't leave anybody outside of the law firm itself. Another important ethics rule is the rule on communication, and that talks about reasonably consulting with the client about the means by which clients' objectives are to be accomplished. And that would mean if you're using artificial intelligence in representing a client, you should tell the client about your plan and get their approval. A question that a lot of clients are going to ask will be, is this going to save me on attorney's fees? Because if you can speed up your research by using artificial intelligence wisely and ethically, it might cut down on the amount of time that you'll be using, spending on behalf of a client. The next ethics rule I want to talk about is responsibilities regarding non-lawyer assistants. And if you take a look, the word says assistants. It used to say assistants, like people, but now it goes beyond a paralegal or a law clerk or a summer associate or even a regular associate in a law firm, but it also goes to any services from outside of the law firm. Again, that would be using any kind of artificial intelligence, the same as it would apply to other kinds of systems that lawyers are using to help increase their productivity. We talked about lawyers using artificial intelligence. Well, it hasn't been lost on judges either, or at least not on judges' law clerks. So there were a couple reports that led to investigation by Congress, by Senator Grassley, about 2 judges who were caught out with some fake citations. Well, the judges ended up saying, well, it's not really our fault. It's, in one instance, it was a extern, a law clerk extern from another law school, and then it was a regular law clerk. But the problem was the federal judges weren't checking the work that these clerks were preparing and sending to them. And they were just issuing orders with hallucinated case citations without themselves checking or even perhaps talking with the student in one instance and the regular law clerk in another instance about their usage. And then, this is the judges admitted to it, but again said, well, it was actually our law clerks. That's pretty disturbing, I think. It also, if you're a law student out there and you're working with a firm or anybody, you'd want to be really careful, because I don't think that judicial externship still has the externship position. And I would suspect that the law clerk who thought I was going to be a law clerk with this judge may not still have the law clerk position. And if a law firm had somebody working for them that got the law firm in trouble because of a fake citation, that person more than likely is going to lose their position unless it happens to be a partner who did it, in which case they probably have ability to stay on. So that's my initial part, and I'll turn it over to, I think, Brian Tamanaha.
So let me immediately begin by lowering your expectations. Unlike Professor Joy, who is an expert in professional ethics, my talk will be about ethics and legal education, about which I am definitely not an expert. I was asked to speak on this panel, I believe, because I made the mistake of saying in a faculty meeting, I'm worried about AI. So now I'm the AI education person. So let me just say, I'm just going to talk about a few fundamental issues and discuss what I think the core problem is. So let's talk just fundamentally about goals of legal education. And education generally, it's often said idealistically, but I believe it's true. Education generally is about truth and the dissemination of knowledge. So legal education is these broad goals, but in a particular context of a professional school. So legal education involves teaching students legal doctrine, skills, ethics, as we've just heard, and more generally about the role of law in society, about justice, morality, all of these very big issues. So these are the pedagogical goals of legal education, and it's our general objective to prepare students to excel as lawyers and leaders within society. Now let me talk about assessments, because that's another critical part of legal education. So we assess students, in my view, for 2 basic reasons. One reason we assess students is to evaluate the level of performance, to identify weaknesses, to figure out what it is they need to improve on. So an assessment is really informative, critical feedback. That's one objective of assessment. But assessments also have a non-pedagogical purpose, and that non-pedagogical purpose is indicating where students stand relative to one another. And this is done through grades and ranking. And all of you understand that we're set up to do this. Now let me move to student goals. So students attend law school for a whole bunch of reasons, but I'm idealizing and generalizing here. So I'm going to say their goals to come to law school are the same goals that we teach for law school. Their goals are to learn legal doctrine, skills, and professional ethics, to learn how to be an excellent lawyer. And then more generally to learn about law and society, learn about justice and morality, and ultimately to have successful careers in the legal profession. But a second goal, and more immediately and less idealistically, is to obtain desirable jobs. And ideally, that involves landing meaningful and well-paying positions. Now, this goal interacts with assessments, what I just described earlier, because students usually want to get the best grades they can, the highest assessment they can, because that improves their chances of landing desirable positions. So now let me talk about the positive impact of AI in legal education. Generative AI, and that's what I'm talking about when I mean it, when I use the shorthand AI, in its present state is reasonably adept at producing legal arguments and preparing basic legal documents, although we've heard about a lot of the problems. But what it can do is prepare drafts of letters and memos on areas of law, and really it can do it in a fraction of the amount of time that it would take lawyers to do. And because it's so efficient, AI is already being incorporated by many law firms, as we saw in this, and they plan to do so going forward. And they want students to understand how to utilize AI in their routine work as lawyers. AI is also pretty good at answering questions about law. If you want to figure out an area of law, providing supplemental explanations. And this is helpful both to lawyers and students. You can get a lot of information by typing in these inquiries. So it's a really excellent source of information and very efficient in terms of the time factor. Now, a critically important aspect to recognize for me about the current situation is that many students coming in the doors now have already been using AI in undergraduate. In fact, they're using it for everything that they do. I know this because I have a daughter in undergrad, and she's telling me that her fellow students are using it for everything all the time. And I think we have to recognize that, because what that means is they come in already adept at this, but not just adept, and this is the critical difference, also dependent on it. They're adept at it and they're dependent on it. Now, there's a big problem with AI, and Professor Joy already indicated what it is. It makes significant mistakes. So the work product itself is unreliable. And because of this error rate, AI can't be used alone to produce legal products. It has to be reviewed by lawyers who can identify and correct mistakes. So those are the positive impacts on legal education, but also with one sort of very large caveat, which was the point of the last presentation. So now let me talk about the negative impact of AI on legal education. It has, in my view, two basic negative consequences. One that cuts against the pedagogical goals of legal education, and the second that cuts against the assessment methods that we utilize, which I also just mentioned. So the first problem that cuts against our pedagogical goals is that AI produces or provides a shortcut that enables students to produce a product without doing all of the preliminary work of researching, analyzing, organizing, and writing answers to legal questions. There are important learning benefits from doing this work yourself, especially in developing critical skills and analytical skills. When students use AI as a shortcut, they have fewer opportunities to develop these fundamental skills. And unfortunately, students who do this are actually depriving themselves of necessary exercises that they need to improve. Or to put it another way, the efficiency gains of AI that AI provides are great for an already well-trained lawyer, but are detrimental for students who have not yet learned to do these basic things for themselves. And for me, that's the fundamental problem. The problem is it's very tempting, it's a great shortcut, but it deprives students of the hard work they need to do, of doing it themselves and learning from mistakes. Now, the second problem that AI poses for legal education, and this is a big one, is that AI enables students to cheat on the assessments. A student can use AI to write a paper for a class or write an essay answer for an exam. And they can use it in various ways to do the whole answer, do parts of it. Either way, it compromises the validity of the assessments, because the assessment's then not based on the student's work alone. Existing programs for detecting the use of AI are not a viable solution, because they suffer from false positives and false negatives. So the idea that somehow we can stay abreast of this by putting these through programs to discover them, I think is something we cannot rely upon right now. Educators have often, when discussing this concern about student cheatings, I've seen out in articles and so forth, have offered, I think, the reassuring only for themselves argument that students who cheat by using AI will suffer because AI just produces average results and makes lots of mistakes. This was true 3 years ago, but I actually believe that the programs have improved a significant amount since then so that it's no longer true. And I'll give you an example. When AI first came out, a group of law professors, a group from several schools, gave 1L law school exams to AI and asked to answer it. And in the first iteration of AI, they did terribly. B's, C's, mostly C's, failing. The second iterations, it was B's and maybe an A. The most recent iteration was mostly A's. And this is just through 3 tests over the last 3 years. So obviously the rate of improvement is substantial and we should expect it will continue to improve. There will always be the flaws. I don't think we're going to eliminate errors. But the point is it can now do a credible job of producing answers to law school exams. So here, the combination of these things produces what I think is a fundamental conflict. On the one hand, students will need to learn how to utilize AI because it will be an integral part of legal practice for their future careers. They will be using this. They need to learn how to do it. On the other hand, AI is a tempting shortcut that deprives students of opportunities to hone their skills, research, analytical writing skills, and in addition, AI provides a mechanism for students to cheat on assessments by passing off work done by AI as their own work. So what's the solution to this dilemma? And the answer, at least in the context of this panel, are legal ethics rules within academia. So legal ethics rules are supposed to find a balance between these problems. So I looked at a bunch of AI policies at a number of schools, just as a comparison, and it turns out, so there's a lot of variation, but it turns out if you read them, they kind of come down to the same thing. So I'm gonna pare it down to, I'll call it a roughly common approach. So the roughly common approach, and these are all relatively new policies enacted in the last couple of years, because we're all trying to deal with these issues. So the common approach basically works this way. They affirmatively set out a total ban, and then, and that serves as the default rule. So here's the official policy. You're banned from using it. And then there's a default, that's the default rule, and individual instructors are then able to modify their policy from there. So that's the floor, and then they go up from there. Now, in these policies, so I'm going to give you the total ban, but as they do the total ban, all of these policies separate exam answers from papers. Okay, that's a fundamental divide in the way the policies are written. So for exams, and this is a constant, students are strictly prohibited from using AI during the taking of exams. And here's a quote from one of the policies, and this, but they all essentially say the same thing. Quote, every word on the exam answer must be produced by the student themselves. So that is a very hard and fast rule. Exams, no AI at all, that's it, you're totally prohibited. Now, having said that, and a number of them expressly address this, say, however, you can use AI leading up to the exam, preparing for the exam as a way you would prepare and so forth, asking questions, all kinds of things to help you preparation. So they draw a sharp line between preparing for exams and taking. When you take exams, it's a total bar. Papers are different and more complicated. So now I'm giving you what I think is sort of the basic common agreement. So the basic way these are formulated, and they're written in different ways, but the basic test that they set forth is that students are not prohibited to use AI in ways that would be prohibited if it involved help from another person or another source of information. In other words, they're framing it that way, saying, look, if you couldn't do it with a person, then you can't do it, or couldn't do it with another source of information, then you can't do it. So for example, students, and these again are described in some of these policies, students typically can brainstorm with other students for papers. They can often get feedback on their ideas. They can even get feedback from other students or others, not only students, but others on their paper. They can say, hey, here's my paper. What do you think? Typically, these are not prohibited. And because these are not prohibited, students can use AI in the same ways as well. So that's the basic idea. Now, but what students can't do, and again, this is the examples that they're using, is you can't have another person write any part of the paper for you, right? So, and students, furthermore, can't copy or plagiarize passages from any other written work. So therefore, AI cannot be used in these ways as well. AI cannot be used to write any part of the paper, and anything that AI produces can't be included within the paper. The rules on AI are actually stricter than the rules on plagiarism in one important way. You don't actually plagiarize if you take a passage from something else, as long as you cite it. But in AI, you still can't do that. You can't incorporate it at all. Not citation, doesn't clean it up, doesn't make it any better. So the way the paper rule is written, it actually is stricter. But it's a sensible way to think about it. So what they're essentially doing, they're making it easy for students and saying, look, if you could do this with another person, fine, you can do it with AI. But if you can't, then you can't do it with AI. Now I'm talking about papers, everyone. So, so those are the two basic approach. One dealing with exams, strict total bar, can't use it to write anything. One dealing with papers, you can use it in any ways you could have used to consult another person or another source, but otherwise not. Now, the problem remains the problem of cheating. Now, ideally, cheating would never occur, but I think it's obviously naive to believe this, particularly when students have a premium on getting high grades to land desired jobs. Again, this is the point about our orientations here. We have lots of different incentives, and that is a very pressing objective for students. One of the ironies of ethics rules, it's the same irony with morality generally, is that ethical people are going to follow the rules anyway. So the problem really is dealing with people who are willing to bend or break the rules. Okay, so now I need to again separate, now I'm dealing with cheating, the difference between exams and papers. So for exams, the obvious necessary reform, and this has been done in a bunch of schools, is that exams can no longer be offered with access to the internet. You cannot have access to AI to take exams. Simply, that has to be an absolute ban. Now, that already applies to proctored exams, so we're fine with that. But lots of schools, and I believe WashU as well, have previously had take-home exams. Take-home exams have to be prohibited. There is no other alternative way of preventing this. Because the temptation for using AI is too great. Now, I want to put on the table something else I started out by saying. Students who come to law school today have already been using AI for everything they did in undergrad. So essentially what we're doing is removing something that they had become reliant upon. So keep that in mind. This is no small thing. Okay, so for exams, and I think this is the general approach being applied in undergrad and law schools generally, is exams are now turning to all proctored, no internet access. It's the only way to avoid this problem. Papers are much harder to deal with. And as I said, because we don't have these programs for testing. So the problem with papers is papers cannot be restricted to in-class exercises, and the internet can't be banned. You know, one solution is people are trying to say, okay, instead of writing a paper, sit down in class and here's the question and write the essay right now. You got 2 hours to do it. The problem with that is we sacrifice pedagogical goals when we do that. Writing a paper is much more involved than scribbling out an answer to a question. It involves research, analysis, organization, writing, rewriting. All of those elements of paper writing are critical to learning how to write. And that is not replaced. In fact, that is lost by giving up papers and just having in-class problems, write an essay in class. So the solution that we can apply to essays, in my view, cannot be applied to papers. I don't have an answer to this problem. So I'm putting it out there. Maybe we can hear from the group what you think about that thing, about that difficulty in relation to papers. Now I'm going to just say a couple things to end. I've been talking about students and ethics and students, but I want to put on the table as well that AI also has implications for law faculty and our own ethics in the work that we do. There are reports out there that faculty are using AI to write exams. Okay, maybe we don't object to that, but that's one. AI has been used to grade exams. Okay, that's getting tricky. Ironically, some people might prefer AI, depending on what you consider the error rate and consistency, whether a machine would actually be more consistent than subjective professors. Nonetheless, I'm raising it to say there are real questions about this, the use of AI to grade exams. And then finally, faculty members are using AI in their own research, and in some cases passing off AI-produced work as their own work. So these are complicated issues. I don't have any answer to any of them. Our main focus so far is on students, but I'm going to say there's another thing coming as well, and that we're putting very little attention to, and that's AI uses by faculty. So I'll stop there.
There's one other faculty use you didn't mention, which is teaching and generating slides. And there's been some incidents where students have found out that their faculty have sort of developed all their teaching materials entirely through AI and have been unhappy about that because they said, why are we paying tuition if we could just do this, by going online? So I'm going to zoom way out. Professor Joy and Professor Tamna have really been focusing on AI ethical issues in the context of the legal profession and legal education. I'm going to zoom out and talk about some much broader ethical issues, I think, that we are facing as a society with the expansion of the use of these technologies across many different areas. There are a lot of this technology is transformational and is having impacts across society, raising all kinds of ethical and policy issues. And these are things that we need to think about as citizens, but also as members of the legal profession in terms of thinking about where it's appropriate to have some kind of regulation or some kind of intervention. So I'm going to just mention a few. There are many others, but a couple of things, some of them are the things I've been focusing on in my own research. So first of all, inequality. The use of AI threatens equality in our society in at least two fundamental ways, distinct ways. First of all, there's a question of inequality between different demographic groups. Because AI is trained on human-created content, and because humans are biased, AI output is often going to reflect those human biases. So and there's all kinds of documentation of how generative AI can reproduce race and gender biases that are reflective of the culture in general. There are also many examples of AI unintentionally reproducing discriminatory patterns that you can observe in society. And so as these technologies are increasingly being used to make consequential decisions in things like who gets credit, who gets a mortgage, who gets a job, who gets into schools, how individuals are treated by government, who gets government benefits, who gets investigated for potential fraud. These kinds of biases are very potentially very troubling because the increasing reliance on AI might be automating this kind of bias. So we have concerns about bias across different groups and sort of traditional forms of bias based on race and gender. AI can also contribute to economic inequality. There's been a lot of attention placed to concerns about AI replacing workers. And there's been sort of this ongoing debate. AI is different. Some people say no, it's displaces some workers and then it creates new jobs. It's fine in the end. I'm starting to see some of the evidence of that in the economic data. In the last couple of years, the number of entry-level jobs in professions like computer science, which are the ones at the moment are most easily replaceable by generative jobs, has been decreasing markedly as compared with other levels of job categories and other areas which are less displacement. So So that's another area of concern where there's potential inequality. And it's not just in the replacement of jobs. It's also because AI tools can be used by firms and employers to do things like surveil workers, de-skill jobs, and all of these have potential implications for worker bargaining here that can affect sort of the balance of power between employers. Those tools can be used to undermine, for example, collective action. So one response, I think, to this sort of news is that, well, what can we do, right? There's sort of this sense of inevitability as technology advances. There's not much we can do about it. Yeah. But I'm really about it. There. Yeah.
This.
Sure. Okay, I'm sorry. All right. Yeah, okay. Perfect. Sorry about that. Okay. So there are a number of ways in which we make choices as a society in terms of what kinds of technology we want to invest in. And there are choices about whether to use this AI technology in ways that enhance workers' productivity, that makes the workplace safer, helps to avoid dangerous and sort of degrading forms of work, or whether the AI is developed in a way that the purpose is to entirely replace workers. So I think that there's sort of social choices that we make there. Okay, environmental impacts. Generative AI requires significantly more computing power, and therefore it consumes far more energy than other digital technologies. And as you've probably heard recently, the AI companies are investing billions of dollars to construct new data centers and build new sources of energy production. So as an example, there's a proposed data center that will be built in northern Louisiana that would cost $10 million for the data center. It would use twice as much energy as the city of New Orleans, and it would require $3 billion in new infrastructure by the utilities. Now, maybe these investments are worth it if the social payoff, if the benefits outweigh the costs, but there are reasons to be concerned. Because of the way utilities are funded, typically the public pays when energy infrastructure is built out. And that's because under the old model, we all benefit when energy infrastructure is upgraded and increased because we all get access to energy to fuel our homes and so on. The problem is that model maybe doesn't fit the world we're in now, where this new infrastructure is needed by big tech, which is highly resourced, right? But under the old traditional model, the financing may involve spreading those costs among consumers, which means that consumers will be essentially subsidizing the cost of this new energy production for big tech. Even aside from the infrastructure costs, there are, of course, environmental impacts of this increased energy consumption. And that, again, is a classic example of externalized costs. So the concern here is that the buildup of AI is increasing environmental costs in a way that the companies themselves are not internalizing. And so we don't have that sort of check to make sure that the benefits of this technology are actually outweighing the costs. Okay, one other example in terms of impacts, mental health. Chatbots built on Gen AI are designed to increase engagement. They are trained to please their users, to provide them with the responses they want and with feedback they will appreciate. And these characteristics are in part responsible for the hallucinations because the AI is built to try to give you an answer, and if it can't quite find an answer, maybe it will find a case that doesn't really say what you want it to say, but it'll say that it says that, right? So this is related to the earlier problem of hallucinations. But even apart from these factual errors, this tendency, this training of AI to please humans has implications for how humans interact with and experience these systems. They are built on immense data sets that have a lot of information about how humans engage, what keeps them engaged. And so they are expert systems at driving increased engagement by humans. They know how to kind of push our buttons, right? Or pull our strings, whatever the right metaphor is there. So there was a recent study by some faculty at Harvard Business School that found that AI companions will use emotionally manipulative tactics to prolong interactions with users. So if somebody's been chatting with one of these bots for a while and then says, okay, I'm going to sign off now, in about 37% of the time they found that the chat bot would respond with something like, you're leaving already, or are you going somewhere? And my favorite, I exist solely for you. Remember, please don't leave. I need you, right? So this is the chatbot engaging these tools that all this data has suggested will help keep humans engaged, right? Now, and these strategies apparently work. For some users, they sort of prolong their time engaging with the chatbot. For most people, this is maybe not significant. Maybe it's sort of annoying, but there are a small subset of users for whom this kind of interaction can have severe mental health consequences. There have been reports of very high intensity users falling into sort of delusional spirals where they're on for, dozens of hours a day, losing contact with family, starting to believe that they have divine powers. There have been a couple of lawsuits now by family members. Tragically, they have lost family members to suicide after these individuals have spent a lot of time on these chatbots. So again, definitely positive uses of this technology, but there are societal impacts that I think we need to be thinking about. Okay, I could go on, I won't, misinformation, deep fakes, undermining trust, effects on democratic representation, all that. You've probably heard some of these things. I just wanted to throw out a couple of examples. But let me talk a little bit to wrap up about the law and policy piece of it. Because despite the fact that this technology is incredibly powerful and it is moving incredibly fast, and it poses significant risks that we are just beginning to understand, the current environment is, I would say, aggressively deregulatory. So prior to 2025, there were increasing conversations with tech companies, with civil society, with political leaders, about recognizing where the risks were and trying to balance the risks and benefits of these technologies, and maybe trying to put into place some kind of oversight or some kind of guardrails to mitigate the most severe risks, maybe through creating standards or best practices to guide development of these technologies. And there were some early attempts at the state level to pass some kinds of legislation. And there was some proposed legislation at the federal level that would address specific concerns about AI safety or bias and discrimination, for example. President Biden had an executive order that sought to harness the potential for good of AI while mitigating these risks by promoting certain principles. It wasn't a hard law, but it was sort of promoting principles about ensuring safety and security, or thinking about safety and security, assessing risks, and so on. This environment shifted radically at the beginning of 2025. One of President Trump's first executive orders in January was titled Removing Barriers to American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence. And it laid out as the primary policy in this area, the enhancement of America's global AI dominance. Now, I think that it is important to think about how America is situated sort of globally in terms of AI, but the way in which that was sought to be implemented is to remove any kind of regulation or anything that was perceived as a barrier to innovation. And so this executive order instructed the advisors to create an action plan on AI to ensure this global dominance by removing any barriers to innovation. The big policy bill that passed earlier this spring initially had in it a moratorium on all state AI regulation for a 10-year period of time. A 10-year period of time in the world of AI is generations and generations, right? That eventually got stripped out of the bill because there was both Republican and Democratic opposition and concern to that. This summer, the Trump administration issued its AI action plan. And it didn't quite revive the moratorium, but it has a very similar type of provision, although it's a little more vague. It says that any AI-related federal funding should not be directed to states that have, quote, burdensome AI regulations. So it's unclear what that means. It gives a lot of discretion to federal officials to decide where these grants will be directed. And the concern is that it might be used to punish states that attempt to do any kind of regulation of AI. It doesn't provide a very clear standard of when that federal funding would be redirected. There's really no transparency about how it's going to be applied, and there's no apparent expiration date. So to be clear, I do think that it is a challenge for companies to have to face a patchwork of state laws on AI. It's not ideal, right? In the best of all possible worlds, maybe Congress would start to think about how to put some guardrails in place or how to try to mitigate some of these risks. But in the absence of leadership at the federal level, I think it is really important to allow states to do some experimenting in this area. States have traditionally been areas of policy innovation. The regulations that have been implemented so far at the state level have actually been quite narrow in scope. And it will be useful to see sort of how those play out. But the current moment we're in, I think, raises a lot of ethical and policy issues because of the significant risks that are raised by the technology and really the quite sort of hands-off regulatory environment that we're in right now. Okay.
Thank you. I have a few questions here. I'd like to start with one of my own for the panel. The question is kind of a broad one for each of you, and it's, is this truly transformative? Is it a change in scale and type, or is it truly a new problem we're solving? For example, with ethics, we've had lawyers who've cited non-existent cases. We just called it lying back then, not hallucinations. We've had people doing all the things we've seen. In school, I'm old enough to have had to handwrite my Illinois bar exam essays, and I typed everything before that. So we've had tools taken away. And I think we've seen industry capture and ideas of primacy of technology before. Is this different, or is it just another flavor of what we've seen before, in your opinions?
Well, I'll go. I mean, I think it's fundamentally different. Let me give you my nightmare scenario, which I didn't fully elaborate. I was talking about the fact that recent college grads entering law school have already been using generative AI. What we have to realize is give it 10 more years, and what will happen is students from elementary school to junior high school to high school are using AI all the way. So if you're using AI and you recognize what it does in terms of the shortcut, the possibility exists that we're going to have students coming through who have never written papers that got redlined and had to write multiple drafts on their own. That's the key point I'm trying to say, on their own. But in fact, would have written those papers with the assistance of AI all the way through. Now, if they had that help all the way through, it seems a necessary consequence of that they will have been deprived of the hard work necessary of getting critical feedback. They won't have developed those skills at the same level. So the scary scenario for me is people coming through, and I'll give it another 5 years before, or 10 at the most, before this becomes the norm, who've never written a paper without AI. Think about that world. And then they're coming into law school. Now, one happy story is, well, if we're all using it for everything, they don't need to learn those skills, at least not as much as we've had to in the past, because AI is there to do it for them. That's the happy story. I happen to believe the opposite, that we will always need those skills, and that those skills are always important and always necessary. And under this, and this, again, I'm answering the question about, is this transformative? In my view, the transformative potential of this is enormous on the negative side. just for the reason that I said, that if you have grown up your whole life and always used AI to do everything you've done in terms of intellectual products, you will not have learned how to do those things yourself. So that's my worry.
I agree with everything that's just been said, but also I'll kind of twist my answer a little to say that I think it's really transformative in terms of the legal profession. There have been many times that the legal profession has had to deal with new technology and transformation. When I went to law school, we actually learned how to research with books instead of everything, on LexisNexis or Westlaw. But that changed in actually while I was in law school. That's when it was first introduced. And that made a big change. But I think with AI, what we're going to find is, and it's already happened, there's a lot of work that's traditionally been done by newer lawyers in large firms like discovery review. That's being done by AI. Contract clause review, that's being done by AI. But what's needed then isn't somebody that could do this basic work, but to do more sophisticated level work. And that's where if people become so dependent on AI doing everything, they're not going to be in a position to actually do that. That's why I think the cautionary tale about students becoming so dependent on AI, if they don't have the fundamental skills, they won't be able to use it correctly.
So I think that there's a slight, it depends in my response. And there's within, I think, the AI community, the people who really know this stuff, which I don't, right? I'm not a technical person. I'm not a researcher, but there's a divide out there in terms of, we've been on this sort of exponential curve, and are we going to keep going on that curve? Are we heading towards agentic AI, super intelligence, general artificial intelligence, whatever you want to call it, right? Where the AI can do everything a human can do, can maybe do everything better than a human can do. That would truly be transformative in ways that we are, just would sort of changes all the questions, right? There's some people who say, well, they're a little skeptical, like, yeah, we've been on this curve, but there's going to be a sort of an endpoint that's going to hit a wall. And then what, right? Is it transformative? Less transformative? Maybe then it will start to look more like other technologies that have been disruptive and posed challenges to society, but eventually sort of society caught up and could adjust to it. So I think there's sort of a technical question in that. And I don't know the answer to that, but I think the signs suggest right now that is wherever in that spectrum it ends up, it is potentially quite transformative in terms of, if nothing else, in terms of the how do I put it, the pervasiveness of the effects of AI and the speed at which it's changing. It feels a little different than other kinds of technological transformations.
Well, just to respect everyone's time, we can probably get one or two audience questions before we head out. If anyone has a question? Or I have more, so don't worry. Please.
I would just add to the conversation. We were talking about sort of societal impacts of it, and whether or not we get to general intelligence or not. I personally believe that it's transformative at this point, and I think that, like, I hear politicians all the time responding to, oh, there's always a place for workers in technological change, right? It always gets redistributed some way. This feels very different. And I think it's a cheap answer, I think, and it scares me that politicians aren't thinking about it more significantly. I mean, I can tell you from my own business, we're working on technology that would make our business more efficient, right? And with it, replace a lot of lower level jobs. And I think some significant thought is put into that.
This is reminding me of a paper I read as a sophomore at Purdue High School. It was a 2-pager, and it was a story about how machines took over the need for humans. And I think that, I've practiced for 52 years, and I can't tell you how many lazy lawyers are out there. there'll always be cheaters, there'll always be, I mean, it's just so interesting to go watch a football game or whatever. And that's my major concern, how we control the genie in the bottle. And it sounds like a losing battle to me without appropriate controls, and I don't even know what those would be. And at the same time, I am very excited about its possibilities.
I wonder if anyone has any thoughts about the intersection of Darwinian principles and the technology curve, and the aspect that at some point humanity has in its best interest to preserve humanity, and where along that curve we might run into that clash of, do we figure out a way to take the transformation and build data centers in outer space because there's unlimited supply of solar energy, and we use deep space as a heat sink, and that's a whole new set of jobs and a whole new industry of itself, versus covering the face of the planet with solar panels, and there's no longer any, like, we've transformed into the Borg and off we go, right? So in that ethical conversation, I'm wondering if if Darwin is starting to come into that conversation of how we make decisions about this transformative technology.
So let me say, I think, I'm not sure this is quite, so when you say Darwin and Darwinian evolution, there's sort of an inevitability to it, right? And this is where I really think it's important to emphasize societal choice, that we make choices, that there are different, even if this technology continues to develop and it's transformative, as a society, we are right now making choices about how we are responding to that, how we're channeling it, where we're putting the investment, right? And so I don't think it's sort of inevitable. Like if the best solution were to put the data centers in outer space, which I never thought about, right? But you're right, solar power, it's cold out there. So if that makes sense, right? Do we have the right incentives in place for the people who are making the decisions to think about that? Or do we have a political economy that encourages them to take the cheapest route, which is right now build data centers in communities that are hurting economically and will take the data centers because they will provide jobs, right? Same thing with the potential loss of jobs, right? It's one thing to say like, okay, this technology is going to go forward. We know that some jobs are going to be displaced. We can say like, oh, well, it marches, technology marches on, or we can say, we see that this is happening, and as a society, we need to make some choices about what we will do to help people get training for those entry-level jobs, or to retrain them, or to develop the technology in a way that will enhance human learning and human capabilities rather than just sort of blanket replacing. So I think my response to you, I wouldn't say Darwinian because that just sounds too inevitable. I think and this is the ethical part of it, right? That as a society, we have to make choices about where we want this technology to go and how we want to deploy it and what are our priorities in developing it.
I'd only add one other point of often we think of technology as a hammer and think of it as entirely neutral, but not really understanding that the choices we make of what technology and why and where we develop it and who we deploy it for are inherently social decisions that we need to make as a group. But I see we're coming up on time, so I want to respect, but if you don't mind, one last question.
Comment. The difference I think about this new tool is its proclivity towards being legal work on crack. We will be so intoxicated and addicted to using it that we can't help it. It's youth.
Yes, I think there's a student question there too.
Oh.
Okay. Yes, I had a question. So I guess for the panel, in what ways do you think there can be sort of more interdisciplinary discussion between, I guess, legal doctrine in regards to like AI and actual people that are doing the research? Me and my friend here were in STEM, so we're part of the STEM part of WashU. And so I guess we sort of we came to this talk in regards to a more perspective of like actually making the technology. And I guess my question would be, in what ways can we sort of build that interdisciplinary discussions in regards to how legal doctrine can sort of lead scientists into creating this technology in ways that are maybe more beneficial to humanity? Because I think sort of like a misconception is that the only way to create AI is through scale, through lots of resources, but there are other technological and research ways to make it sort of more efficient. If you sort of think of the human brain and how the human brain only needs like 8 cups of water, 3 meals a day and stuff like that, sort of like leading towards research that's more energy efficient and would be less costly on like human resources. So is there sort of a way to create that intersection in regards to researchers talking to lawyers and creating that document?
I'm so glad you're here. The solutions are not all legal. And as I've talked about, right, there are lots of legal obstacles to trying to solve these problems, partly for political reasons, but also because they're really hard to legislate or regulate in advance. And so that's where the ethics part of it comes in. I think the people who are developing these technologies have just a huge role in terms of thinking about the policy issues and the risks and then trying to build in a direction, right, that is more socially beneficial. And so I think those, so I'm really glad you're here. And I think that those conversations are very critically important. I've done some work with computer scientists and I'll say they're hard too. Right. But they're happening more and more. And I think that it's really important. The law won't always be able to provide the answers, right? But can sort of tee up some of the questions that can help guide the technology, right? And the technologists can really help lawyers and policy people understand what makes sense and what's feasible or not in terms of regulation. So I think it's a hugely important area to develop.
I think one of the reasons why what you said is so important is because last week that McKelvey and the Institute for Public Health had a joint AI presentation, and they had Rachel Storch from the law school, they had a medical doctor, they had a computer scientist who is building these things, and they were on the panel together. And when you ask those 3 people, would they trust the self-driving car that is proven to be safer than a human driving? Can you apply that same question to AI medical diagnosis from a doctor? And the computer scientist said, yes, I will trust the AI. The doctor said, no, the doctor has one-on-one personal information about you that the AI doesn't have. And the lawyer said the classic law school answer. It depends. But that's why we all have to work together.
And one other thing I'd mention is actually just earlier today, we had a panel on AI in healthcare, and we had Qinyang Liu from the AI Health Center here at the med school. We had Rachel Sachs and we had Neil Richards. One of the things that actually Qinyang said that I thought was really interesting was they are actually looking for law and policy to give them some direction as to what to build and why. Even if just from a selfish reason, if doctors aren't going to use tools if they don't know where liability lands and they don't understand what can go wrong or how they should understand standards of care. So I think getting that conversation going between the disciplines to then say, okay, if we incentivize and create structures to create incentives, that's how we can help steer what technology wants to do.
Can I just add one comment? I mean, I think there's a critical component, it was alluded to by Pauline. We live in a capitalist society, and so all of our orientation, our whole political economy is about capitalism. There's a realistic, we need to begin from that ground and understand we live in a context in which maximizing overall wealth is the goal that drives all of these policies. By maximizing overall wealth, of course, you're not taking care of distribution, nor are you taking care of negative consequences. And I think as a society, that's where the fundamental discussion has to be, right? Is our goal economic growth at all costs, or are we willing to make the choices that you're saying involving trade-offs about less for better consequences? I don't see that conversation anywhere being made by policymakers, right? Maybe a bunch of leftist academics might be mentioning it.
Yeah.
But other than that, I don't see it being discussed at all.
Because the question about Darwinism is survival of the fittest the best answer, which is kind of where you were going with your answer, but I think goes more to what you were saying about what is the end result that we want.
Well, thank you all for attending. Appreciate it.